Okay, so let's first think about what we're actually doing here. We're trying to piece together something that on the surface looks like a simple family holiday gone wrong, but underneath starts revealing all these strange layers of emotional pressure, logistical confusion, and quiet contradictions. It's not just about pointing fingers or assigning blame, but about asking how something like this could unfold, what the environment was, who was under what kind of stress, and why little decisions made in passing might have had far bigger consequences than anyone expected at the time. And what's funny is when you start looking at the fine print, the packing, the timeline, the locations of gifts, you start to see a system that was kind of teetering from the inside out. And if we really sit with that for a second, we can start to see that this isn't just about one night. It's about the buildup to that night. It's about a mother trying to juggle too many things at once, a father coordinating from a distance, kids with different emotional needs, and a house full of moving parts. It's about pressure dressed up as tradition. And once you throw in the idea that Patsy may have been staying up all night, or at least not sleeping well, you start to understand how that level of strain changes how people move, how they respond, how they remember. So maybe it wasn't all neat and clean. Maybe it was messier, more human, and more psychologically complicated than people want to admit. What might be worth noting is that the cracks don't always start with, sometimes they start with wrapping paper and late night tasks and people just trying to hold it together. And that's what makes this case so unique, not because it's full of drama, but because it's full of things we recognize: family dynamics, overcommitment, emotional hiding, and the silent toll of trying to be everything for everyone. And if we start with that instead of the headlines, we might actually find a clearer picture of what was going on in that house before everything fell apart. Let's delve into the discussions surrounding Patsy Ramsey's packing activities for the planned trip on December 26th, examining when, where, and what she packed, and the various destinations. So we start by looking at the planned trips for December 26th and maybe others beyond that. According to Patsy Ramsey's 1997 interview with the Boulder Police Department, the family was planning to travel to their summer home in Charavoy, Michigan on December 26th. This trip was intended for a couple of days. John Ramsey, in his 1997 interview, mentions that it was his idea to spend Christmas in Charlevoix, but Patsy wasn't initially real excited about the idea due to potentially nasty winter weather, though she eventually came around and was looking forward to it. Following their return from Charlevoix, they had plans for a second trip, a Walt Disney Big Red Boat Cruise in Florida, starting on Patsy's birthday, December 29th, and lasting through New Year's. This would have been their first family cruise and was chosen as something special for the children. Okay, so let's first think about what it actually means that Patsy was the one expected to do all the packing for the Florida trip. If we're talking 1996, we're still sitting in a cultural moment where the traditional wife and mother role was deeply ingrained, even in affluent households. Volunteering didn't exempt her from being seen as the one responsible for household logistics, especially during big events like a family vacation. So in this case, packing wasn't just about throwing things in a suitcase. It was about curating an experience, matching outfits, making sure everyone had the right shoes, sunscreen, bathing suits, dress clothes, casual clothes. And for a trip like Disney and a cruise, that's essentially packing for 3 climates: resort casual, theme park chaos, and cruise formal night. And if we consider the social expectations layered on top of that, being a former pageant queen, a public-facing family, this wasn't just logistics. It was presentation. Her family was a reflection of her. And what's worth considering is that this kind of packing isn't really just about clothes. It's a form of emotional labor. You're managing not just whether an outfit changes, but personalities. What JonBenet will complain about, what Burke will forget, what John will expect to magically be there without asking for it. You're trying to anticipate emotional reactions days in advance. And the thing about emotional labor is that it builds up in invisible ways. If we're talking about criminology or forensic psychology, especially in family crime contexts, we know that women, particularly caretakers, often become backgrounded figures in their own stories. They're doing for everyone, and yet their stress is dismissed because they're not physically laboring in the way that's legible. But cumulative, repetitive stress is real and often discounted in investigations because it doesn't leave a visible trace until it does. And we can continue to think about how the pressure to maintain that perfect family image might have compounded things. If Patsy is packing not just for function, but for appearance, coordinated family outfits, Disney photos, making sure no one forgets toothpaste or socks, then every minor mistake becomes a judgment on her capability. That's where the physiological layer kicks in. Chronic stress impacts the brain's executive functioning, decision-making, memory, patience, emotional regulation. If Patsy's under pressure, not just in the moment, but for days leading up to the trip, then one small emotional disruption, like a defiant child or a last minute change, can tip her from stressed to overwhelmed to reactive. And it wouldn't necessarily be visible on the outside. She'd still look like a woman holding it together, but inside, cortisol through the roof, exhaustion, irritability, probably insomnia. Along the same lines, if we put ourselves in the mindset of someone who's trying to hold a family together through both appearance and coordination, and then add a layer of hidden resistance, maybe from John being emotionally detached or disengaged, or the kids not cooperating, then packing becomes symbolic. It's not just a chore, it becomes a microcosm of her whole role in the family, keeping people organized, happy, presentable, making things happen without appreciation. That kind of imbalance, high responsibility, low control, is exactly the kind of psychological profile that leads to breaking points in forensic profiling, especially in cases where something explodes inside the home and you're trying to piece together motive, not in terms of premeditated, but in terms of a moment that spiraled from weeks of unacknowledged tension. What's also interesting is the way the calendar played into it. Patsy's birthday was right around the corner, and instead of being celebrated, she's the one making sure everyone else is ready for a trip. There's a quiet kind of resentment that can creep in there, not the loud, accusatory kind, but the kind that whispers, "No one sees me." And in criminology, especially in family based cases, that invisible feeling, feeling unseen, feeling secondary to everyone else's needs, can be a key ingredient in unraveling how stress and identity crisis snowball into something darker, especially in a woman who's used to being the center of attention, like a former beauty queen now boxed into motherhood. When you remove the spotlight and pile on responsibility, what happens to her sense of self? And in addition to that, you've got the unpredictability of the children themselves. JonBenet especially, who, based on interviews and accounts, was strong-willed, sometimes defiant, very performative, and also a little emotionally demanding. Add Burke into the mix with his own behavioral quirks, and now you're not just packing. You're project managing two young personalities with a strict deadline. And John? He's likely just focused on the plane or logistics or whatever's happening with the Charavoy's arrangements. So once again, it falls on Patsy to keep the invisible threads pulled tight. And if any one of them snaps, a tantrum, a spill, a forgotten item, it's her fault by default. That kind of imbalance is worth dissecting when we try to understand not just behavior, but motive and reaction under pressure. Also remember that forensic analysis often overlooks this kind of slow burn, pre-crisis buildup. Investigators tend to focus on what happened instead of why someone was already emotionally on the edge. But if we use deductive reasoning and trace the emotional and logistical buildup through this idea of packing, a task that seems small, even trivial, we start to see it's actually the tip of the iceberg. Underneath that are layers of identity, resentment, emotional overload, and performance. And what's funny about that is people might say, well, it's just a trip, just a suitcase. But when you break down all the symbolic meaning that suitcase holds, expectations, invisibility, control, pressure, it's not just fabric and zippers. It's a reflection of everything she was trying to carry. What might be worth noting is how often in family crime, the forensic profile starts after the explosion, after the scream, the strike, the disappearance. But if we rewind and sit in the days before, we start seeing patterns. A mother stretched thin, a woman whose own needs, birthday, rest, emotional space are sidelined, a family heading into an unusually complex series of trips with conflicting obligations. In that context, the act of packing becomes a pressure point, not a footnote. And if we really want to understand the environment leading up to that night, we can't skip over it. We have to sit with it. Because emotional explosions don't just happen in the big moments, they erupt from the small ones that were never acknowledged. Okay, so if we start by thinking about this idea that this Charlevoix trip felt like an unnecessary burden to Patsy, then we have to ask, unnecessary for whom? Because from John's perspective, maybe this trip made perfect sense. It was a gesture of unity, a blending of his two families during the holidays, something symbolic. But if you're Patsy, staring down the barrel of a multi-stop holiday season, having just finished throwing a Christmas party, still coordinating a New Year's cruise, and now you're being asked to squeeze in a detour that doesn't even directly involve you emotionally, yeah, it's going to feel like a lot. And what's funny is, on paper, it's just a few extra days. But psychologically, it's not just anything when your bandwidth is already maxed out. And we can continue to think about how, when someone is asked to do something that feels unnecessary or even irrational, especially under stress, it introduces a sense of being controlled or dismissed. In criminology, especially when you look at family dynamics prior to high stress incidents, this feeling of one partner overriding the needs of the other, especially for something symbolic rather than practical, can trigger deep resentment. You're not just disagreeing about logistics, you're hitting a nerve that says, my needs don't matter, my exhaustion doesn't register, and even worse, it's not like she could say no. Because saying no to a family Christmas with the stepkids and the fiance makes you look cold, detached, maybe even selfish. So she has to smile and go. But internally, she might already be shutting down. Along the same lines, if we zoom out and look at the pattern here, it's a bit revealing. John's the planner, right? He arranges the plane, the sequence of flights, the meetings in Minnesota, the connection to Charavoy, all of it. It's a kind of masculine coded logistical control, and maybe for him, it's an act of generosity or efficiency. But what gets lost in that kind of top down decision making is the lived reality of the person executing the human side of it. He's thinking itinerary while she's thinking food, clothing, mood, child behavior, and her own energy level. And philosophically, if you think about it through a forensic lens, this is how fracture points form, when the architect of the plan isn't the one who has to live inside its consequences. What's also interesting is the timing. December 29th. That's not a light day on the calendar. That's 2 days after Christmas and just days before the cruise. So even physiologically, most people's systems are taxed at that point. You're coming down off the adrenaline of Christmas, your sleep is probably a mess, your diet's been chaotic, you might be drinking more, and your stress hormones are swinging. That's when mistakes happen. That's when arguments spike. That's when people start forgetting things, snapping, miscommunicating. And if you layer that over a trip that you didn't even want to take, that's fertile ground for emotional misfires. And in addition to that, there's something to be said about the way power functions in a marriage like this. John was the financial head, the logistical head, maybe even the social head in many ways, but Patsy was the emotional head, the curator of family culture. So when one side starts making decisions that the other side has to carry emotionally and physically without consultation or compromise, it stops being a partnership and starts being a kind of quiet subjugation. And that's where resentment turns dangerous, not always in visible, explosive ways, but in the kind of passive aggressive withholding or psychological fatigue that builds and builds until there's no capacity left to absorb even one more task, one more trip, one more stressor. Also, remember that forensic investigations rarely give enough weight to these internalized dynamics. They look for motive as if it's always a smoking gun, an affair, a custody battle, a financial problem. But motive is often rooted in slow emotional erosion. A woman who's been told one too many times that her feelings are secondary, who's been put in situations she didn't ask for, who's had to mask her fatigue for appearances. She may never say a word out loud, but her nervous system is keeping score. Her reactions will shift, her tolerance will drop. And if something goes wrong on that trip, or if it seems like she's once again being made to feel small in a moment when she's already holding too much, then maybe what follows isn't about that moment alone. Maybe it's about all the invisible decisions made without her. What might be worth noting is how these little conflicts, how and where to spend the holidays, are actually massive markers of family hierarchy. Where you go, who you see, how much effort is required, and who it falls on, says everything about who holds power and who is expected to accommodate. Patsy having to fly to Charlevoix instead of just seeing the stepkids in Atlanta isn't about geography. It's about emotional labor being imposed without reciprocity. She's probably thinking, why are we bending over backward for this when there's a simpler way? And if she voiced that and got ignored, or worse, got gaslit into thinking she was just being difficult, then that resentment metastasizes. And what's funny is that even the way she'd have to process that frustration would be limited. She can't lash out. She can't refuse to go. She can't show up bitter and risk tension in front of the older kids. So now she's performing happiness she doesn't feel, executing plans she didn't make, and internalizing the contradiction. That internalization is something forensic psychologists pay a lot of attention to, because when you're forced to split between your true emotional state and your public behavior, your psyche becomes unstable. You lose your grounding, and you're more susceptible to reacting impulsively later, sometimes irrationally, sometimes destructively. And that's not to say something happened because of this trip, but if you're trying to understand why tensions might have already been running hot inside that house, this Charlevoix detour isn't just a footnote. It might have been the final drop in an already overflowing glass. Okay, so if we start by thinking about the actual logistics of this whole trip, the multi-stop, multi-city, everyone meets here but then flies there kind of setup, it really doesn't make much sense on a practical level. You've got people flying from Minnesota, connecting in Boulder, then going to Charlevoix, only to eventually circle back to prepare for a Florida cruise. That's a lot of movement, especially in winter when weather delays and misconnections are a real risk. So if you're already balancing that against packing fatigue and post-Christmas burnout, the whole itinerary feels bloated. And not just bloated, it feels disorganized in a way that creates more problems than it solves. That's where the deductive reasoning starts to creep in, because you start asking, who was this plan really for and what was being prioritized, convenience or control? And we can continue to think about what this logistical overload does to a person's mental state. When there are too many variables to manage, different locations, luggage, plane capacity, outfit changes, extended family, timelines, the brain starts to shift from problem solving mode into what neurologists call cognitive overload. You hit a threshold where the executive function becomes impaired. That's decision fatigue. That's short term memory issues. That's irritability. And in a forensic context, when we study cases involving household conflict or even breakdowns in routine safety, like forgetting to lock a door or failing to notice something unusual, it's often tied to that exact kind of overloaded system. If something strange did happen around this trip, you have to wonder, was it missed or misunderstood simply because there was too much happening all at once? Along the same lines, this kind of travel plan starts to look like it was designed more for optics than efficiency. Like if you tell someone you spent Christmas in Charlevoix, that hits different than saying you just went to Atlanta. It's got this layer of prestige, this idea of curated holiday luxury. So if we're thinking about the psychology of someone like John, high level executive, public facing, always managing perception, then maybe this convoluted trip was never about what made the most sense logistically. Maybe it was about showcasing something. And that creates tension when the people around you are the ones paying the price for that performance. Criminologically, that's something we see in family dynamics, where there's a pressure to maintain a certain lifestyle or image, even when the practical needs of the family are being neglected. The cracks don't always show immediately, but they're there. What's also interesting is the plane itself being packed to capacity with people and luggage. That detail stands out because it means they weren't traveling light. They weren't trying to streamline anything. They were hauling everything, maybe even unnecessarily. So now you're talking about logistical constraints, weight limits, storage space, limited seating, and that just adds to the sense of chaos. If there was any miscommunication or error, there was no room for flexibility. Everything had to work exactly as planned, or the whole thing would get disrupted. And in psychological terms, that's a pressure cooker environment. People don't operate well when there's no margin for error. That's when small conflicts become big ones, and that's when people start saying or doing things they wouldn't under normal circumstances. And in addition to that, think about the emotional whiplash involved. You're going from Boulder to Charlevoix to Florida. That's freezing cold to warm. Different clothing, different moods, different expectations. That's three entire emotional settings to prepare for in a matter of days. And we know from psychological research that environment changes can spike stress when there's no recovery period. The body doesn't get a chance to reset its internal rhythms, sleep, digestion, hormones. People get sick, tired, emotionally thin. So again, if something went wrong, anything from a forgotten gift to a miscommunication between family members, it wouldn't take much for it to escalate. Also remember that part of forensic framing is looking at whether people were set up to fail, not in a malicious way, but just based on the sheer weight of the situation. Sometimes environments are so poorly structured that it becomes impossible for people to maintain safety, peace, or emotional regulation. This travel plan has that flavor. It's so ambitious, so sprawling, and so misaligned with what makes sense practically that it puts everyone in a vulnerable state before anything even happens. And that's what makes it worth pausing on. Not because the travel caused anything directly, but because it set the stage for breakdowns in communication, judgment, and emotional stability. What might be worth noting is that people tend to look at things like this trip as background noise, just the setting for the real story. But in reality, it is the story. It's the architecture of the days leading up to a major event. And when something happens in a family, forensic investigators are trained to examine not just the incident itself, but everything in the 48 to 72 hours leading up to it. Who was tired? Who was stressed? Who was being ignored or overburdened or silenced? So if you zoom out and look at this trip, not as just another travel day, but as the context for everything that followed, it starts to look a lot less innocent. It starts to look like a domino setup that was already wobbling before the first one fell. Looking then specifically at Patsy's packing on December 25th. In her 1997 interview, Patsy Ramsey explains that On Christmas Day, December 25th, she was actively engaged in both wrapping gifts and packing for these upcoming trips. She recalls trying to get clothes ready for 4 people to go in 2 different places. For the Charavoy trip to their lake house, Patsy states that she was packing a few things in a plastic bag. This was because they already had clothes stored at their Michigan home. She believes this packing for Charlevoix took place in the laundry room area, which is located right outside JonBenet's room. John Ramsey corroborates this, stating in his 1998 interview that he is a light traveler when they go to the lake, as he has clothes there, and doesn't remember packing anything himself aside from possibly a heavy winter coat. For the Disney cruise, Patsy describes packing suitcases. Specifically, she states that the suitcases for the cruise were packed in John Andrews' room, which she also refers to as a guest room with a black bedspread, located up on the same area as JonBenet's room. She had 2 or 3 black suitcases there. Patsy's own suitcase for the cruise was in her dressing room. These suitcases for the cruise were intended for summer clothes. John Ramsey recalls in his 1998 interview that Patsy had already done some packing in anticipation of the big red boat trip, primarily for the kids so they could just grab our suitcases and go upon their return from Charlevoix. In his 1997 interview, John also recalls some suitcases sitting out by the back stairs, usually 3 bags. He also mentions having a black carry-on and his laptop computer ready to go by the garage door, possibly set out the night before. Regarding gifts for Charlevoix, Patsy indicates that she had some presents bagged up and kind of ready to go up to the lake for Melinda, Stuart, and John Andrew. She also had a Lego set for Burke's birthday in January stored downstairs. She mentions continuing to wrap some presents for the lake trip in the basement, specifically in the washing machine area. John Ramsey confirms taking some presents up to the airport on Christmas Day, having preloaded them into the airplane. He remembers having a kind of second Christmas for his older kids in Charlevoix and a few little extra presents for Burke and JonBenet so they wouldn't feel left out. Some of these presents were in a butler's kitchen, the lower level kitchen, and he might have gotten wrapping paper from there or the basement. Patsy remembers being busy that day, trying to get clothes ready for the 2 different destinations for herself and the children. She also prepared for a pageant JonBenet was to attend in early January, laying out a yellow swimsuit and cover-up. Okay, so if we start by thinking about the way wealthy families move during the holidays, there's something inherently chaotic but also oddly structured about it. Like, it's not just spontaneous travel, it's curated, almost ceremonial. There's an image to maintain, a certain energy that needs to be carried from home to home. Think holiday cards, matching outfits, polished appearances, planned photo ops. And when you zoom out, the whole thing feels theatrical, not just in appearance, but in rhythm. You're talking about planned joy, scheduled wonder, if you will. And in a family like the Ramseys, that curated atmosphere isn't just about enjoyment. It's a way of life, a brand even. So when you throw in cross-country flights, multiple family homes, step siblings, pageant culture, and wealthy social expectations, the entire holiday season becomes a kind of moving production. And we can also think about how this kind of festive migration mirrors broader cultural patterns. Rich families aren't just celebrating, they're staging a lifestyle. Going to the mountain house, the city condo, the beach property. It's performative mobility, and it tells the world we have options. And that's fine in theory, but the people behind that performance, especially the women, often become the unacknowledged labor behind the image. For Patsy, that meant being the holiday coordinator, the memory maker, the one who keeps the magic alive. But in criminology, especially when analyzing internal family stressors, this pattern becomes important, because the weight of being the one who makes it all happen rarely gets reciprocated. It's heavy, and it doesn't go unnoticed when emotional fractures occur. On the same topic, there's also a sensory load that comes with the holidays that we often overlook. Think about the noise, the lights, the wrapping paper, the scents, the music, the food, the constant movement from one place to the next. Now amplify that with wealth, more gifts, more events, more guests, more expectations. For someone like Patsy, it's not just the logistics, it's the stimulation. That sensory overload has real physiological effects. The brain has to process everything while still keeping track of the next task. Cortisol levels rise, sleep suffers, memory lapses, frustration brews, and that's even before anything goes wrong. So when we study cases that happen during high stimulation periods like the holidays, we have to account for how those layers affect behavior and perception. And in addition to that, the performative energy of the season often suppresses honest emotion. Like if someone's sad or tired or overwhelmed, they're expected to tuck it in because it's Christmas, because it's family time, because you don't ruin the vibe. But that suppression builds pressure. And in forensic psychology, especially in family centered incidents, we see that suppressed emotion doesn't vanish, it just stores itself somewhere else. Sometimes it surfaces in passive aggressive behavior, sometimes in bursts of misplaced anger, sometimes in moments that spiral unexpectedly. If everyone's pretending to be joyful while juggling resentment or stress, the environment becomes emotionally dishonest, and that can quietly shape the context for future unraveling. What's also interesting is the nostalgia factor, the way the holidays make us revert back to childhood patterns even as adults. Everyone goes back into their old roles. The older siblings are older siblings again, the parents take charge, the family hierarchy reasserts itself. That can be comforting, but it can also be incredibly constraining. For Patsy, returning to Atlanta might have felt familiar and warm, but being pulled into John's version of holiday celebration, something colder, more complicated, more centered on his extended family, could have triggered a quiet resistance. The Home Alone reference isn't just about the vibe, it's about the emotional contrast. You've got the chaos, yes, but also that central tension between being seen and being forgotten, between feeling included and being left behind. We can continue to think about how the role of women in these holiday migrations tends to mirror broader themes in gender dynamics. Patsy wasn't just traveling, she was transporting a lifestyle. She was expected to carry the energy of Christmas, the weight of family cohesion, the warmth of gift giving, and the perfection of presentation, all while still managing her grief, her fatigue, and her sense of self. And that's where forensic theory intersects with feminist criminology. Because when something breaks, when a crime happens within this dynamic, too often the focus is on the physical act, not the emotional framework that was already cracked. And that matters, especially when trying to understand patterns of behavior that precede a domestic tragedy. What might be worth noting is how families like this operate on the illusion of effortless happiness. Everything looks good on the outside, so no one questions what's happening beneath the surface. But if you have to relocate, repack, rewrap, and represent a perfect holiday 3 or 4 times in a span of 2 weeks, Charavoy, Atlanta, Florida, then that's not celebration, that's performance art. And performance by nature is draining, especially when your audience includes children who can't see your exhaustion and a husband who seems more focused on where the plane is headed than how you're holding up. And what's funny about that is when things go wrong, people often look back and say, but they looked so happy. They see the Christmas cards, the lights, the coordinated outfits. But the truth is, a lot of forensic analysis happens in reverse, trying to decode smiles, holiday plans, even packing lists to understand what someone was actually going through. Because no one documents stress, no one photographs tension. And that's what makes these holiday migrations so slippery, because they look like joy, but sometimes they're just really beautiful pressure cookers. Okay, so if we start by thinking about this idea that going to Atlanta would have made more logical sense, it really does start to unravel the entire structure of the Charlevoix trip. Because when you think about it geographically, emotionally, and logistically, Atlanta seems like the path of least resistance. That's where the older kids are, that's where Patsy's extended family is, and that's where their other home is already set up to receive company. So the Atlanta option isn't just about convenience, it's about alignment. Alignment with family obligations, gift delivery, rest routine, and most importantly, emotional familiarity. It's the center of gravity that could have anchored the holidays instead of spinning everyone out across the country for what seems like an unnecessarily complicated route. And we can continue to think about what kind of psychological message that sends to Patsy. Because when you bypass the easy option in favor of something convoluted, something that requires more effort, more travel, more packing, it starts to feel like your well-being was never the priority. And in criminology, especially in family-based psychological profiling, we often examine how patterns of being disregarded, whether subtle or overt, accumulate over time. The detour to Charlevoix might have looked festive and inclusive on the surface, but underneath, it signaled something different. That John's vision of togetherness took precedence over her need for rest or practicality. And that misalignment between what's needed and what's planned can quietly foster deep resentment. On the same topic, this Atlanta versus Charlevoix question reveals something even more subtle, a failure to consolidate holiday labor. Because the truth is, by going to Atlanta, Patsy could have combined her responsibilities. She could have wrapped and handed off Jenny's gift in person. She could have delivered presents to both sides of the family. She could have avoided the dissonance of leaving a clearly misassigned pair of panties in a bathroom drawer. In criminological terms, this is where spatial reasoning and narrative consistency collide. When people lie or cover things up, spatial logic is often the first thing to fall apart. And when something doesn't make sense logistically, it often points to a deeper truth being concealed. In this case, the insistence on Charavoy disrupts that clean narrative, and that's worth thinking about. What's also interesting is the ripple effect of that one travel decision, because once you decide to go to Charlevoix, everything else bends around it. Now you're redirecting the older kids to Minnesota. Now you're reloading the plane. Now you're rerouting your energy. The cost isn't just in miles or hours, it's in cognitive resources. It fractures the family's internal compass and forces everyone, especially Patsy, to adapt to a plan that doesn't seem to have her fingerprints on it. And that creates an emotional distance. When people are forced to carry out plans they didn't design and don't agree with, they often detach, not just emotionally, but physiologically. The body enters a state of resignation. Stress hormones spike, fatigue becomes chronic, and executive function diminishes. And in addition to that, you've got this very strange inconsistency about the gift for Jenny Davis. Why would a gift intended for a niece end up upstairs in JonBenet's bathroom drawer when all the other presents were reportedly stored in the basement or the butler's kitchen? It doesn't make sense logistically. And that's exactly the kind of inconsistency that forensic analysts pick up on. It's not that it couldn't happen, it's that it doesn't fit the pattern of behavior that we expect from someone as detail-oriented and socially conscious as Patsy. This is a woman who planned entire galas, who managed a family brand, who remembered tiny wardrobe details for multiple people. So if we believe that Patsy could misplace a gift like that, we also have to believe she was mentally compromised or distracted in a very specific way. That's when the analysis shifts from innocent forgetfulness to forensic curiosity. Also remember that misplacement, especially of symbolic items, is often the result of internal conflict, not carelessness. If something about that gift triggered discomfort, guilt, or contradiction, it makes sense that it might end up in an unusual place. In forensic framing, we look at how displaced objects often mirror displaced emotion. Something meant for one person ending up in another space, that's not just a logistical error. That can be a symbolic leak, a psychological bleed between intention and action. So the placement of the Wednesday panties isn't just a logistical detail. It might be a clue about someone trying to hide, forget, or justify something deeper. What might be worth noting is how this whole detour, the rerouting to Charlevoix, the missed opportunity in Atlanta, the strange placement of the gift, creates a fracture in the family's timeline, a fork in the road where the easier path was visible but never taken. And in forensic logic, we often ask, why choose the harder route unless you needed the appearance of family unity more than the substance of it? Why complicate things that didn't need to be complicated? And why risk unraveling the very structure you've worked so hard to maintain unless it was already unraveling behind the scenes? Because when the logic breaks down, it's rarely by accident. It's usually because someone's trying to force a narrative that no longer fits. Okay, so if we start by thinking about this whole issue with the Wednesday Bloomies ending up in JonBenet's bathroom drawer, what immediately stands out is how inconsistent that feels with Patsy's personality. This is someone who is known to be detail-oriented, image-conscious, and highly capable when it comes to organizing not just her own life, but everyone else's. We're talking about a woman who coordinated pageants, managed charity events, color-coordinated Christmas decorations, so the idea that she would accidentally place a gift meant for Jenny Davis, her niece, in her own daughter's drawer, completely away from the other presents, just doesn't line up. It's not just a misplacement. It disrupts the internal logic of the household's holiday flow. Gifts had a location, a system. So now we have to ask, how does something fall out of that system? And we can continue to think about how that accident plays out narratively. Because once something like that is found, panties with a day of the week label that doesn't match the child's age or normal wardrobe, it forces a backstory to emerge. The backstory then becomes, oh, well, those were actually for Jenny Davis and they got mixed up. But that's not just a casual explanation. It's an intervention into the narrative to account for something that raises forensic suspicion. In criminology, this is where we talk about narrative repair. When people go back and add a reason to explain something after the fact, it often means the original event wasn't clean, it didn't follow expected behavior, so it needs to be patched. And patches don't always hold up under scrutiny, especially when the logic within them starts to fray. Along the same lines, we have to factor in the spatial disconnect. If all the other gifts were either downstairs in the basement or in the butler's kitchen, spaces designated for holiday storage and prep, then why carry this one gift upstairs to the child's personal bathroom, especially when it's a gift that's been acknowledged as not being for that child? It's not efficient, it's not safe from being forgotten, and it's not aligned with the household system of order. So we're not just looking at a misplaced object, we're looking at a break in behavioral continuity. And in forensic profiling, breaks like that are always red flags. They suggest either a mental lapse or an emotional override, both of which are critical in understanding motive, mindset, and post-event justification. What's also interesting is that this one item, the bloomies, sits at the center of a forensic contradiction. On the one hand, we're supposed to believe Patsy was juggling 1,000 things, packing for a trip, organizing gifts, keeping John's business materials in order. But on the other hand, we're also being told that she made a critical error with something as basic as gift placement. And that duality is hard to reconcile because physiologically, the mind can be overwhelmed, yes, but when it is, it forgets big things, not tiny symbolic ones. It forgets to pack a toothbrush, not the location of a specific item that already had a destination. So if this truly was an error, it would be more consistent with emotional dissociation or internal stress, not just everyday forgetfulness. And in addition to that, we have to think about what the object represents. Underwear is intimate. It's not the same as misplacing a toy or sweater. So when it gets misassigned, it creates a kind of symbolic dissonance. That's why forensic teams pay such close attention to items like clothing, especially when they cross the line from utility into intimacy. A gift like that landing in the wrong place doesn't just confuse the narrative, it destabilizes it. It creates a tension between what's said and what's seen. And in criminal psychology, when the physical evidence contradicts the verbal account, the body of the story starts to sag under its own weight. That's often when new theories emerge. Also, remember that this isn't happening in a vacuum. This is part of a tightly timed sequence of events: packing, travel, family arrivals, emotional pressure. The window for this gift to be moved from wherever it was originally wrapped to JonBenet's bathroom is small. So if we start reverse engineering the steps, when it was wrapped, where it was stored, who touched it last, we're left with a logistical pathway that doesn't justify the outcome. That's how deductive reasoning and forensic analysis works. We backtrack the movements of an object to see whether they match human behavior. And if they don't, that tells us the object didn't move itself. It was placed either deliberately or subconsciously in a way that doesn't make sense if the person is telling the truth. What might be worth noting is how these small inconsistencies are often treated as irrelevant or no big deal by the people trying to maintain control of a story. But forensic work is built on exactly these kinds of contradictions. Because it's rarely the huge, dramatic elements that expose cracks in a case. It's the misplaced item, the altered routine, the explanation that only works if you don't ask too many questions. And what's funny about that is the more effort people put into defending these small mistakes, the more weight they actually carry. Because if it really was nothing, then it wouldn't require such specific elaboration. The story would hold without the patch. And when it doesn't, that's when you start to look again, not at what was said, but at what was done. Lastly, we deal with Patsy's packing on the morning of December 26th. According to Patsy Ramsey in her 1997 interview, she intended to finish the Charavoy packing on the morning of December 26th, which would involve throwing in toothbrushes and last minute kind of stuff, as well as putting stuff in the car, packages. The Ramseys planned to get up early on the 26th, with their alarm set for 5:30 a.m. to prepare for their flight out by 7 a.m. John Ramsey states, he woke up a little before 5:30 a.m. and went to shower. Patsy also got up around this time, a little before 5:45 a.m. She went downstairs using the back spiral staircase to the kitchen to make coffee and get breakfast ready. She was getting things kind of laid out, ready to go for the trip. John recalls seeing Patsy dressed when he first saw her that morning after he had showered. Patsy doesn't recall if she had laid out clothes for JonBenet or Burke for the morning. Okay, so if we start by thinking about this idea that Patsy's entire schedule in the days before JonBenet's death was dominated by packing for Florida, packing for Charavoy, wrapping gifts for multiple families, and juggling birthdays and pageants, it immediately starts to feel less like holiday stress and more like cognitive overload, and not just physical exhaustion, but decision fatigue at a pretty intense level. When your brain is cycling through dozens of micro decisions, who gets what gift, what goes in which suitcase, what pageant clothes JonBenet needs, what gets shipped, and what gets hand-delivered, it's not just about being busy. It actually weakens your ability to regulate emotion and maintain clarity. And so what might look like she just forgot to pack something could really be the surface of a much deeper issue, one where everything was starting to slip a little out of her control, even though she was trying hard to hold it all together. And we can also think about another related idea, which is how performance-driven stress hits differently when you're also emotionally invested in the outcome. This wasn't just a trip, it was her birthday trip, her daughter's pageant, and a chance to make things perfect. That's important because perfectionism doesn't operate on logic, it operates on fear of failure. If Patsy was the one keeping the family functioning, making the holiday special, keeping up with social appearances, ensuring the kids felt equally loved, then she may have been measuring herself not by how well she was doing, but by how much she was able to hide how tired she was. And in forensic psychology, that's a key point, because people who carry all the pressure but never express the burden are more likely to crack quietly, suddenly, and often unexpectedly. Along the same lines, the specific way that Patsy staggered her preparation, putting off packing for Charavoy until the morning of the 26th because it didn't require much, tells us a lot. She likely prioritized tasks not by urgency but by emotional complexity. Florida required more clothes, more variety, and it was tied to her birthday, so that carried a kind of weight. Charlevoix, by contrast, seemed like a simpler event, just a few warm outfits, a quick trip. But what's interesting is that in putting off the easier task, she may have unintentionally created a bottleneck, leaving herself with just enough to do the next morning that she didn't sleep much, or maybe not at all. That matters because once sleep deprivation enters the picture, the whole nervous system changes. Reaction time slows, judgment gets fuzzy, and you become less emotionally resilient, especially under pressure. And continuing that thread, it also sets the stage for a forensic question about opportunity and timeline. If Patsy was indeed up late, or possibly all night trying to finish wrapping and packing and organizing, then it places her physically in motion during those late hours. Not asleep, not in bed, but up. Maybe on the second floor, maybe walking between rooms, maybe in a state where any interruption, say a child waking up to use the bathroom, would cause a collision of exhausted emotions. And in criminological terms, we often see that moments of high stress coupled with emotional volatility create flashpoints, especially when they involve caretakers who are already overwhelmed. What's also interesting is how none of this looks suspicious on its own. A mom wrapping gifts, a woman organizing a family trip, a pageant coming up, a birthday in the mix. But when you start layering them, when all of it is happening at once, with no recovery time, no decompression, no one stepping in to lighten the load, it starts to paint a picture of someone running on empty. And when someone is running on empty, they don't behave in perfectly rational ways. They overreact. They forget things they normally wouldn't. They lash out or shut down. And that's what forensic analysis tries to uncover, not just what happened, but why someone might have behaved in a way they never had before. What might be worth noting here is that this kind of stress, the invisible kind, is often left out of investigative narratives because it doesn't look like motive. But it is motive in a different sense. Not premeditated intent, but structural pressure that builds until someone's system can't take anymore. And when you factor in not just the holidays and the trip, but the emotional significance of each event and the fact that so much of it revolved around Patsy doing everything for everyone else, you get a very clear psychological profile. Someone trying to do it all, to be it all, and possibly, just possibly, reaching a breaking point at the worst possible time. Okay, so let's start by thinking about this whole idea of the perfect family image and how fragile that really is, especially in the 1990s when families like the Ramseys were being idealized in this upper middle class polished kind of way. You've got a successful father, a former beauty queen mother, a little girl who's a local celebrity, a picturesque home, Christmas parties, travel plans, matching holiday pajamas, all of it. And it's not that they were pretending to be perfect necessarily, but there's a very curated image here, one that aligns with what we might call the American aspirational family. It's clean, controlled, socially connected, and publicly admired. And yet what's strange is how quickly that whole thing comes undone, almost like it was held together with string the whole time. And we can continue to think about how that collapse plays into the deeper psychology of guilt, shame, and image management, especially when something devastating happens inside a family that was working so hard to appear intact. Because the truth is, when a family spends a lot of time curating their image, the shame of failure of any crack in the facade hits even harder. That's what makes Patsy's references to Susan Smith and O.J. Simpson so telling. She wasn't just grasping at headlines, she was speaking from a place of psychological awareness. She knew what this kind of public unraveling meant, and she feared being cast in that same light. So the image wasn't just for others, it was protective. It was armor, and when something disrupts that armor, people scramble to preserve it, even if that means bending reality. Along the same lines, we also have to account for John bringing up Beth, his eldest daughter who had died years earlier, and placing her loss emotionally alongside the loss of JonBenet. That tells us a lot about how grief was already nested in this family. There's a layering of truth that's never been fully metabolized. And that becomes important in criminological framing because unprocessed grief can skew how people react to new tragedy. It creates distortions in memory, behavior, and emotional regulation. And it's also why people sometimes avoid the truth. If the image is the only thing holding the family's emotional structure together, then to let that go is to risk collapsing completely. So denial or avoidance in that context isn't just lying, it's survival. What's also interesting is how forensic investigation often overlooks this emotional ecosystem. They look for cause and effect, motive and means. But what if the motive isn't just what happened that night, but everything the family was trying to preserve? That shifts the question from who would do this to who would be desperate to avoid what it would mean if this story gets told truthfully. That's not about evil intent. That's about emotional terror, the kind that makes people cling to a version of events not because it's true, but because it keeps them psychologically intact. And that's not uncommon in family cases. It's actually a major theme in forensic psychology when image management becomes its own defense mechanism. And in addition to that, think about how society at large plays into this. The media didn't just report the Ramsey story, they devoured it, they turned it into a spectacle. So any deviation from the perfect image, any hint that something messy or human had occurred was going to be magnified 1,000 times. And that's why the stakes were so high. For Patsy, every decision, every word, every appearance, every flashbulb moment was under a microscope. And if she felt that microscope on her before anything went wrong, imagine how sharp that scrutiny would have felt afterward. That kind of pressure doesn't just affect memory, it reshapes it. It restructures how people tell the story, even to themselves. What might be worth noting is that in the end, this isn't just a story about a crime or a tragedy. It's about the collapse of a structure. Not just a family structure, but an emotional, cultural, and psychological architecture that had been built very carefully and was not designed to withstand catastrophe. And that's what makes the story so haunting. Because you're not just watching a mystery unfold, you're watching a whole identity unravel under the weight of its own expectations. Okay, so let's start by looking at this idea that Patsy may have pulled an all-nighter, or at the very least had a deeply fragmented night because of everything she was managing in those final 24 hours. Not only does that make sense practically given the amount of wrapping, packing, and organizing she had left, but it also introduces a kind of temporal vulnerability. When someone is up late, operating on stress and adrenaline, and cycling through task after task, their awareness gets foggy. They're more likely to lose track of time, forget small details, or make impulsive decisions. And if we're trying to figure out who might have been awake at the same time JonBenet got up, or whether Burke's story of being awake lines up, it's not a stretch to say Patsy could have very well been in motion when all this unfolded. And we can also think about how this kind of late night overstimulation affects someone's physiological state. When the body is running on stress hormones, especially cortisol, it starts burning energy reserves it doesn't really have. Add to that the emotional component of the holidays, the expectations of multiple family events, and the pressure of JonBenet's upcoming pageant, and what you get is a nervous system that's on edge. In that state, small interruptions can feel enormous. A child getting up to use the bathroom, a sound in the hallway, a realization that something still hasn't been packed. And when the brain is in that hyper alert but exhausted state, it's more likely to misfire emotionally, whether that looks like snapping, shutting down, or something worse. And continuing with that, we also have to consider the physical layout of the home and how it aligns with this theory. If Patsy was up and about, maybe in John Andrews' room or in the hallway or near the second floor common areas, then she was spatially close enough to hear JonBenet stir or see Burke if he happened to be awake. That creates a zone of proximity-based plausibility, meaning it's not just speculation that all three could have been awake. The house itself supports the possibility. The stairs, the open sight lines, the shared bathrooms, all of that positions these interactions within reach. So the question becomes less about whether they cross paths and more about what happened when they did. What's also interesting is how this positioning gives shape to timeline reconstruction, one of the most important tools in forensic framing. If you know who was awake, where they were, and what they were responsible for at the time, you start building a logical picture that isn't just about guilt or innocence, but about environment and opportunity. And when someone is under physical strain, emotional pressure, and cognitive fatigue, their ability to respond rationally in an unexpected situation is compromised. So if something happened between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m., whether an accident, a misunderstanding, or a panicked overreaction, it would be shaped by all of those invisible pressures already at play. And in addition to that, there's this overlooked truth in family-based cases that presence doesn't equal intent. Just because someone was awake doesn't mean they planned anything, but it does mean they may have witnessed something, responded to something, or even cleaned up after something. And when people say, well, why would Patsy lie about being up? The answer might not be nefarious. It might just be self-preservation. Maybe she didn't want to admit she'd been frazzled, that she hadn't gone to bed at all, or that she had in fact heard something she couldn't unhear. And that's where forensic psychology kicks in, not to accuse, but to understand how psychological pressure distorts recollection. What might be worth noting is that this whole concept, that all three could have been awake in close quarters, navigating intersecting pressures, doesn't require a conspiracy. It just requires human vulnerability, a late night, a holiday crash, a family pushed to its limit. And if something unexpected did happen that night, it probably happened in that messy intersection of stress, exhaustion, and chance, not because someone was calculating, but because someone was overwhelmed. And that framing doesn't excuse the result, but it does help us understand the climate in which it became possible. So then what are we really left with? A house full of pressure, yes, but also a set of timelines, behaviors, and emotional signals that don't totally line up unless you start layering the psychological context on top of them. Maybe Patsy was awake, maybe JonBenet woke up, maybe Burke was wandering around, and maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a clean, quiet night at all. Maybe it was noisy in its own subtle way, emotionally chaotic, physically exhausting, and full of unspoken tension. It's not about jumping to conclusions. It's about not ignoring the buildup that set the whole thing in motion. And we can continue to ask better questions. Not just who did it, but who was holding too much. Not just why didn't they notice something was off, but how many layers of performance were they already carrying before this even happened? Because once you start asking questions like that, the contradictions start making a little more sense. Not in a comforting way, but in a human way. In a way that tells us this was never going to be a perfect picture, no matter how hard they tried to make it one. What might be worth noting, really sitting with, is that sometimes the answer isn't in the evidence alone. It's in the patterns, the inconsistencies, the decisions that don't quite fit. And maybe instead of trying to solve it from the outside in, we try to understand it from the inside out. What broke first? Not the rules, but the rhythm, the routine, the emotional system. And once that starts to go, everything else, no matter how carefully packed, starts to unravel right behind it. And with that being said, as always, I appreciate your support. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and share and subscribe if you haven't. And until next time, take care of yourself.